I would like to welcome everybody to the Orlando Sentinel's last candidate endorsement and review of 2022. And we are joined by Paula Stark, who is the Republican candidate in a House district that is anchored in St. Cloud. And people there are very familiar with her because House District 47 covers an area that has been long served by the Osceola News Gazette. She's the long-standing. She was a publisher there, and now she is with St. Cloud Main Street. And we want to thank her for her patience in getting this set up, because we did initially have her scheduled with her opponent, who is a Democrat named Anthony Nieves, and that didn't work out, because we gave her the wrong date. So we're really glad that she took the time to be with us today. So I'd like to go ahead and get started. We're going to spend about half an hour, as I said, talking about the issues, and we will be making a recommendation in this race. So the first question goes to the only duty that Florida legislators have. By law, the only thing they have to do is write a state budget. And starting sooner than we thought, this is going to be a pretty difficult task next year. There's going to be the expenses associated with Hurricane Ian, which could end up in a considerable whack to the general fund if insurance companies are unable to cover the cost of the massive damage that's happened. And then, of course, the federal money, that most of which went into reserves, but some of which helped prop up the budget last year, will be drying up in terms of the money from COVID. So what do you think Florida needs to do in terms of securing extra revenue, making sure the budget picture is stable for Floridians headed from one crisis to another?
Basically, the fact that the budget's been pretty sound and secure for the past couple of years gives us a good starting point. So we don't have as much to be concerned about as maybe in other times. Obviously, we deal with hurricanes on a somewhat regular basis, so we're not new to how to overcome those issues. I'm sure what we're going to have to do is look at what is going to come through FEMA to be of assistance to all of the different things, especially in the southwest version of Florida, to see what gets covered there. As far as the normal for the COVID funds that probably are running out, what is going to help with that is the huge growth we've experienced. We now have a lot of additional people in our state, and especially in our community for sure, that now are paying additional property taxes, and we have funds that are coming in there. So hopefully you have to flush out those numbers and see how that works, but hopefully it offsets a significant part of what some of that might be.
You mentioned Central Florida and the money that's going to be coming in through all the growth there. What can you talk about your budget priorities for your district, and what needs you think the next representative for this area should be tending to first?
Yes, it's very, very, very important to the constituents in this area. And let me clarify our district just a little bit. It does have the city limits of St. Cloud, but it also goes into the very east side of Kissimmee. We don't quite go into the downtown Kissimmee area, but we do go up into the BBL area and then Meadowwoods, which there's a small portion of Orange County that's in this. So it's a little bit more broad than St. Cloud. So all of those particular areas, and I can tell you last night we went to a fundraiser which was out at Gaylord Palms, and even trying to get to the Gaylord Palms around 6 o'clock was like impossible. So we've been experiencing traffic issues here And now they're just exasperated this past week for a variety of things. One was we've closed down the canal because there's a bridge being worked on. And just that one item alone has completely backlogged all of our streets in trying to get from one point to the other. People who normally it takes them 20 minutes to get someplace of spending an hour and a half in their car trying to get to work and home. So our roads and our infrastructure in Osceola County and South Orange have to be the major priority, along with figuring out how we can better go at our growth. You don't want to stop growth, and there's certainly some positives from growth, but you have to be able to manage it along with what you're doing with your infrastructure so that you can make sure that the health and safety of your community is primary. So that would be my primary issue when going to Tallahassee, would be to address the needs of the roads and infrastructure that we have here.
And another budget issue has been the fact that Central Florida, and particularly your part of it, has become a great donor to the state of sales tax revenue that it doesn't get back. You've talked about the need for that money to come back to the community. But a lot of money also flows from this area to Visit Florida, the state's tourism market arm. Do you believe Visit Florida is a good investment for Central Florida? Are we getting our money's worth out of them?
Well, I can tell you from working in the Main Street community, Visit Florida is a huge part and partner with the Main Streets across the state. So I do think there's a huge value for Visit Florida. I think that they are doing an effective job of bringing tourism to us. So that is a huge and significant part of it. Now, what does that dollar amount always look like? I think that's something that has to be considered on an ongoing basis, which I think they have been doing a pretty good job of reviewing that every year. So I think it's very strong and very positive. I do believe that if we have issues funding infrastructure, that the tourism tax could be looked at to see if there's any portion of that that could be moved over into the roads. Since tourism is impacting our roads, it makes sense that maybe some of that funding could assist with any of the needs that we have. Our roads deteriorate faster than we can get them built. So we have to look at all of that together. But yes, I think they do a great job of bringing tourism to the state.
If my colleague Scott Maxwell had been here, you would have just won his heart. He's asked every candidate about tourism development taxes so far.
Okay.
That is something he's been pretty passionate about. And one more budget question, which is another pressing need, because you are seeing massive residential growth in Osceola County, but you're also seeing a great deal of pressure from lower income residents who cannot find housing. Should the state do more in this area to boost the availability and affordability of housing?
Well, Chris, I think I have a yes and a no answer to that. I know there is a need for affordable housing, and I certainly would support that to a point. My fear and what I'm seeing in our community is that perhaps we're going too far in that direction, and we're not focusing enough on bringing the right kind of industries and commercial businesses in, and then having the educational opportunities for that lower income population to be able to bring themselves up to have better jobs. My focus would be that we change that dynamic so that we don't have to look so strongly for just affordable housing. Obviously, there's always a segment of that has to be considered, and people need those kinds of opportunities. But I think job training, additional jobs in our community that have better paying wages brings people out of that. I would rather give them a hand up and not a hand out. Although some of both has to happen. And I realize that, but we do need to look at that. And in Osceola County, I am afraid we're headed the wrong direction with that.
What more you had mentioned development as an issue. What more do you think the state can do to encourage smart development, understanding that the legislature in the last 10 years or so, under Governor Rick Scott, certainly moved away from the state's growth management philosophies that were once in place.
Well, I think we're going to have to go back to some additional guidelines. I think concurrency needs to be looked at again. There's a big kind of rift, so to speak, right now between what our county says and what the state says on concurrency. So I think that has to be flushed out, and then everybody has to be on that same page, and there's not fingers pointing at one another. It's okay, this is how it is, and this is where we're going. So concurrency can make a difference. And I just think that we're going to have to look at our lands and our availability. Like some of the areas through the hurricane that flooded are in areas that there should not have been that development there. And you get a hurricane, and that is the proof of why that should not happen. So we have to look at how does that flush out as well when we're putting these huge developments on properties that are already wetlands, so to speak, and then we're sitting here in these kind of situations. So I think we have to do a better job overall of how do we, put guidelines in place that prevent some of that, and then we manage the growth by making sure also that our infrastructure is in place before we do the growth. And we're doing it the opposite right now. So that has to change. So those would be some of the things that I would want to look at on the state level to see that we can't trickle that down into our state and communities so that they do a better job of managing this.
Another challenge that is a significant problem for the people working in the tourism industry in Osceola County is access to affordable, available health care. Do you think Florida should take advantage of the federal government offer of assistance in expanding Medicaid so that working adults are eligible?
Well, I think we need to look at that a little bit more, on the state level in the budget. Healthcare and Medicare is the number one budget item. So, you have to look at the numbers and see how does that flush out? How do we additionally bring those dollars in here without doing that, inconsequential other problem that you might create without knowing it. So I think we have to take some looks at that, but I think the insurance industry overall needs to be looked at. It's not just the Medicare. I think pretty much all of it needs to be reformed in some form or another, although that's really a difficult task, as we can tell, from Obamacare to not Obamacare. And, everybody has a different opinion on how that works out. So I think there's going to have to really be some strong discussions in the Medicare area. We've talked to some people in the healthcare industry who are advocates for, the community. And I think they have some really strong ideas and thoughts. And I think I would like for them to come to the table and be able to express some of those ideas and see if there are ways that we can do that. And is it something that we can fund without federal dollars? I don't know. Maybe that is a possibility. But, I think we have to look at, okay, do we want to sustain ourselves on our own, which is really a noble idea if we can do that. But if it prevents our people from being insured and being able to be taken care of, then I think we have to look into the federal dollars.
Thank you. And you had mentioned property insurance. I think that's the insurance you were thinking about. And we did not get a chance to discuss this with your opponent, but I'd like to know, do you have any ideas as to what Florida could do?
The insurance issue all on its own is just a huge, huge dynamic, and it's really not very clear cut. And I have a lot of friends who are in that industry, and they don't even have, clear cut answers for it. But some of it is maybe we don't allow as much building, say, for example, on the beach areas. if people can't afford to get insurance to insure their homes on a beach, then maybe we don't allow them to have that home on the beach, because then you end up subsidizing people, under these other programs. And, is that the right thing to do? I also think we have to get in front of this fraud issue. That's part of the problem, is we have these people are going out doing these appraisals, and then there's these, guys who are giving kickbacks to these companies to do, new roofs or whatever it happens to be. We have to get our hands around that. If we don't solve that problem, then this will continue. But I do think that's significant, especially here in Florida. The coastal areas is huge. That drives a lot of our problems, I think. And a hurricane is a prime example of that. Obviously, we all like to be on the beach. We love the view, all of that is wonderful, but to what expense? So I think we just need to look at the issues, but I think the number one thing is to get our hands around all the fraud that's going on.
Okay, well, and I did want to ask you about one of the most divisive issues that's going to be confronting the legislature, and it may come up before the next legislature is sworn in, but how far do you believe, and if you could be specific in the kinds of restrictions and in the amount of time, how far should the legislature go in restricting a woman's ability to have an abortion?
Well, here is how I feel about this, Chris. I have a really long answer for this too.
Okay.
So number one, I will tell you, I personally am pro-life. If it were my decision, I would never make a decision to abort a child. I just would not. On the other hand, I think that to some extent, you have to have that little bit of wiggle room in there to give them the opportunity to have the choice. Obviously, we all have one judge and jury at the end of the day. And so, if they make that decision and that choice, just like we make other choices throughout our lives, then that's, what you have to go to heaven to find out, I guess. But I think that giving a first trimester, or in this case, the state's law that they passed, this past legislation, was 15 weeks. I think that's appropriate. I think that gives a woman plenty of time to make a decision. It covers incest, it covers rape. It pretty much takes care of the major issues that everybody has without, putting yourself in a situation where you feel like you're taking a life beyond that. So that's pretty much where I am on it. And I'd like to tell people, as women, and especially back when I was growing up, birth control was just coming on the scene back in the 70s. And then, it was fine tuned. Well, now we have so many choices in birth control methods that it shocks me sometimes, some of the opinions that we have as women, that our only recourse is abortion. I just don't see that as necessary when we have all the other choices that are out there and available to us.
Florida is struggling with some issues in terms of a pending teacher shortage.
Mm-hmm.
And there have been two things identified. The first one that I'd like to ask you about is schools. Pay. The legislature has mandated higher pay for starting teachers. That has caused a ripple effect, with many starting teachers making close to what veteran teachers make.
Right.
How does the legislature address that?
Well, that is interesting. I will tell you, and you may know this yourself, having been in the newspaper industry for 29 years, and we were owned by different companies along the way, that really isn't all that unheard of. The bigger issue, when you're in the private sector, is no one knows what the other one makes. So, you have that whole dynamic that doesn't factor in. So I think if you're going to do starting wages and at a minimum, then you have to address the percentages. It has to be done in some kind of percentage way to be able to address it for veterans teachers as well, because if they're not getting a pay raise that is at least coming close to what the cost of living rate is, then, they're not getting ahead either. So I do think that has to be looked at. And I think we have to do a better job in the schools as a whole to keep the teachers there. So there's so many dynamics happening right now in the school systems, across our country. And I think we have to look at all of that to see, how do we kind of balance all of it to keep our teachers in place. And I don't know about you, but I can remember the names of my teachers when I came up through school, and the ones who were very impactful in your life, and everybody has one, so you have to take that into consideration. But you have to take into consideration too, we didn't used to have to deal with all of the different issues that they're dealing with now. So all of that has to be discussed, most of it on a local level.
Well, that brings me to my last question for you, which is that the state has made some mandates that have teachers very anxious, angry, and upset. The Stop Work Act, the Don't Say Gay bill, and the recent declaration by the State Board of Education that teachers could face serious sanctions if they violate these rules. Do you think that's the right way for Florida to go, or do you think? I mean, do you believe the governor was appropriate to ask the legislature for those moves?
Well, you hear different sides of this, and everybody kind of they sometimes read into their emotions into what is written, and you have to kind of balance that out a little bit. So I agree that we should not be teaching our children, especially our grade school children, things that should be taught at home. We shouldn't be dealing with that. We should be dealing with what we're there to teach them and how we're supposed to groom them academically. That should be our focus. So when these other things, factor in, that really is unfortunate. And I think it really needs to be done on a local level. Because what's happening in your schools on a local level. Sometimes we make these, mass mandates across the board that you don't know even if it's an issue someplace. Some places have issues and some places don't. So, but I do think that there has to be some kind of guidelines, because I think our society has shifted so much that we're forced to address some of it. So I am concerned that teachers feel anxious about it. That's unfortunate. But is it the reality? Is it really what is happening? Are they really getting sanctions placed on them? Or is that just a belief that they think is going to happen? So I think we have to, that our school system right now and what's going on is probably the biggest issue that we have, I think, as a country, honestly. And we have to look at that and get this flushed out, both for the children and for the teachers, because teachers have to feel confident in what they're doing every day when they go to school. But I do not believe we should be teaching those things in school. But I can see the issue of the teacher, feeling like, okay, well, what happens if I do this or I don't do that? That needs to be settled for them. So I think that just has to have a discussion. Maybe there just needs to be a whole panel that's, put together on the state level, different people from the communities that come together and talk about that. And then, then you can identify, okay, well, what's the right and the wrong way to do this?
Well, thank you very much. We really appreciate, once again, you working with us, and we also appreciate Mr. Nieves's patience in waiting for us to get the video posted.
Sure, he's probably wondering what's going on.
we need to make sure that we let him know that we're going to be good to go soon.
Yeah.
But we want to thank our readers as well, because this is a very important campaign season. And while we will be making an endorsement in this race, we want you to keep looking at the information that's out there. Both of the candidates in this race have really good comprehensive websites that give you a lot of information on their positions and their background. Our reporters will be covering this race, and and there's just a lot of information out there. So look at what's available, and try to find the candidate who best matches your positions and beliefs. And the most important thing is to remember to vote on November 8th, or before, because there's early voting starting. And thank you so much for taking the time with us, and we thank Ms. Stark again.
Thank you all.
And wish you luck.